Wonderful. So it looks like we have a handful of folks from the West Coast, a lot of folks who are studying for the GMAT right now, a couple of folks from the East Coast. Wonderful. Thank you so much. Hopefully you're all surviving the stifling heat that we've been dealing with on the East Coast. Yeah, we'll go ahead and get started now. I think we've got 2 minutes past. So just go ahead and feel free to start dropping in. As I mentioned, feel free to drop in where you're dialing in from, where you are in the process, and any questions that you have about the MBA admissions process. Just as a way of a brief introduction, so my name is Joanna Graham. I've been working with Target Test Prep for the last about 6 months, but I am a veteran in the MBA admission space. I've spent over 22 years in the industry, including 10 years as a product manager for the GMAT exam. So if you also have if you have test prep questions as well, certainly feel free to drop those in as well. I'm happy to talk GMAT or GRE shop all night long as well. Let's see. Let's go ahead and get started then with our conversation for today. So just a little bit of an intro on Target Test Prep itself. So Target Test Prep, most of you probably know Target Test Prep as a test prep organization. They offer everything from GMAT focus and GRE prep, everything from sort of live online courses, individual tutoring, pretty much you name it. And they've been around in the space for quite a while. They did just recently in the last year start offering admissions consulting, and that's where our team of admissions consultants and I come in here. And so for most of us, we've spent anywhere from 1 to 2 decades in the space, and we are able to work with clients on any piece of the application process. So as you can see here, everything from application review to early strategy to mentorship, or if you are an undergrad, I saw a couple of folks mentioning that they're looking at deferred entry programs, 2+2 strategy. And then depending on where you are in the process, or as you go through the process, if you don't use someone to sort of support you through the application process, can certainly help you kind of coach you through the interview process if you get there as well. Great. So our agenda for today, so we'll talk a little bit just about, give an overview of what they call holistic admissions and what that actually means in the world of MBA admissions. And then, as I mentioned, we've collected a handful of questions from folks ahead of time, broken down sort of into these buckets. But as I mentioned before, definitely feel free to drop in any questions that you have regarding the process itself. All right, so when you think about holistic admissions, the idea of holistic admissions is just that. It's that admissions officers and these programs are really looking at you, the candidate, in a very holistic way. So they're looking at every piece of your background, your professional experience, your academics, your test scores, your extracurriculars, really everything that you have done, starting with your undergrad career all the way through your professional experience to get to where you are today is going to factor into the equation. And the idea is that different parts of your experience are going to really give the admissions committee a better idea of how you will perform in a competitive MBA program. So as you can imagine, professional experience really is sort of the backbone of this. Schools want to see what have you been able to do in the workplace since graduating? What types of experiences have you aggregated? How have you been able to demonstrate leadership? Where have you been able to step up? What types of skills have you developed? And really, what have you been able to do with the opportunities that you've received or that you've created for yourself? The next piece of it really is the academics. So thinking about what your undergrad experience was like, and potentially for those who might have a master's degree already, how you've used education to really help further your career, but also how have you been able to challenge yourself? You know, when you were in school, did you take curriculum that was challenging? And is that reflected in your undergrad GPA or even in your graduate GPA? Next up, you have test scores. And this is the one piece, as most of you probably know, this is the one piece that you actually can control to a certain degree in this process. So whereas the professional experience and the academics and really your extracurriculars in many ways are a bit static at this point, there's not much you can do to change those. The test score is the one piece that you can influence in this process. And we'll certainly spend some time tonight talking a little bit about some of the pros and cons of testing and how to think about parallel tracking, test prep with working on your applications at the same time. Extracurricular activities really are designed to give an admissions officer and a university a sense of the type of person and specifically the type of community member that you're going to be on campus. And so are you going to be the kind of person who just shows up, goes to class, checks in, checks out, but doesn't necessarily engage with the broader community? Or are you going to be someone who really tries to get involved? Are you going to be joining clubs and organizations? Are you going to be an active participant in your cohorts? Really, the idea here is that, they're thinking about are you going to leave the university a better place than you found it? And how are you going to make your mark while you're a student? In that same vein, community service is certainly important as well. The idea again that universities are parts of larger communities, and so are you going to limit your time to the university itself and the campus itself, or are you going to think a little bit more broadly about the broader geography around you? The next couple are really all sort of, I'll try to tackle all these together. What schools are looking for as well is they want to see if there's alignment with their mission and values. And with that kind of comes this idea of a brand or a very distinct point of view. This is all going to come to life in your essays, to a certain extent, a little bit in your resume, but certainly in the interview as well. And one of the things that I tell a lot of my clients to do as they're thinking about sort of how do I really look for or think about what a school is looking for, because let's be honest, a lot of schools do start to sound very similar once you start looking at website after website. And one of the things I encourage folks to do is to go and take a look at the mission statement or the values page for a university or a school, and really see how are they choosing to articulate what is important to them and how are they prioritizing those things on their website. And so if a school talks about being an academic center of excellence, that's telling you right out of the gate that academics are king, that research is going to be king. Whereas there are some schools, that will talk and potentially lead with talking about more this idea of community or creating an environment that is primed for social discourse. And so really being cognizant and attuned to the way that schools are choosing to talk about themselves is going to be incredibly important. One of the things you can also think about too, about how to weave this into your application are these ideas of soft skills. And I'm sure everyone's heard about these. These are all those wonderful things that you've developed over a period of time. Many you were probably born with and have nurtured over the years. But schools really want to see what type of person are you. These really, what type of person you are and how you're sort of bringing some of these things to life. So things like intellectual curiosity, how have you shown leadership, or if you've faced some adversity, how have you demonstrated grit and resilience? How do you deal with bad news or when you have to pivot? And there are, again, multiple ways for that to enter it into your application. And then finally, the interview. In the interview, many schools will offer interviews to everyone. Many schools will offer interviews by invitation only. It really depends on the program. But if you are fortunate enough to be invited to interview, this is a great opportunity for you to breathe a little more life into your application and make it a bit more three-dimensional, building on some of the things that you've probably talked about in your application already, but also an opportunity to add in some additional new information. And we'll certainly talk a little bit more about that in a bit as well. So there it is. That's your guide to holistic admissions. It really sort of encompasses this idea of trying to find an ideal fit. And we'll certainly, like I said, talk a little bit more about this throughout today's session. So let's start with a couple of our questions regarding timelines and planning. And so a lot of times folks will ask, well, what is the difference between rounds? And is there an advantage to applying round one versus round two? Or in some cases, maybe is it too late to even be applying round one right now? And so as many of you have probably seen, and it sounds like most of you are looking at round one right now, based on what I see in the chat. If you're thinking about round one versus round one basically it's the first set of deadlines. So they're typically early fall. So as early as the first week of September, programs like Kellogg and Wharton are going to have deadlines that are early, that are typically first or second week of September. You'll have some programs like UT Austin, the Macomb School, their round one deadline isn't until October 15th. And so it's certainly important to make sure as part of your research, you're taking a look at when those round one deadlines are. But typically round one deadlines are going to be early fall. Round two will be around the first of the year-ish, sometimes as early or sometimes as late as the first week of February. And then some programs will offer round three or even potentially round four. And those deadlines will typically be mid to late spring or sometimes late spring if there is a fourth round. And really the difference between rounds is just that they're different intakes. And so students and applicants are going to have, I would say, certainly some perceived advantages of applying earlier. If nothing else, there is, and many people feel that there's a bit of a first mover's advantage. If you're a part of that first cohort for round one, you're going to be one of the first applications that the admissions committee sees. And especially if you're coming from an industry, perhaps that is a bit overrepresented. So as you can imagine, there's no lack of management consultants or finance folks applying to business school. A lot of times folks will feel that it's advantageous to try to have that first mover's advantage, to be one of the first applications that someone sees. There's every admission cycle is going to be a little bit different, and schools don't necessarily know what the next cohort or what the next group of applications is going to look like. And so they're going to be looking to accept the best, so the best applications that they see in that particular round. And more often than not, there will be slots allocated in each of the rounds for certain types of profiles. But it's certainly not uncommon. I think for folks to wonder, would I have been a stronger fit potentially for a program, or maybe a better fit if I had applied in an earlier round, or if you're in a later round, how do you stack up against the folks who applied in the first round? So what I would encourage you to think about is, as you are building out your timelines, as you are thinking about these deadlines, if you have a list of 3 to 5 schools that you're applying to, certainly rank stack them. And so prioritize the schools that are most important to you, the ones that you feel are the best fit, and start. Obviously, I in an ideal world, I think everyone would try to apply round 1, but certainly prioritize the schools that you feel are the best fit for you and what you want to do in the future. And then have a backup plan, essentially. So you start working methodically on those applications, on those essays. And if you do get to a point, usually 2 to 3 weeks before that deadline, and you feel that you don't have a product that feels like a 90% solution or better, then it's probably time to have a conversation with yourself and to reflect on, does it make more sense to wait until round 2 when I can put together a more meaningful application and one that better represents who I am? Or in some cases, sometimes depending on the way promotion cycles work, sometimes folks like to wait until round 2 because they might be going through a promotion cycle in the fall, and they think that promotion will be something that they can tout on a round 2 application as opposed to round 1. So there are a variety of factors that go into the calculus behind round 1 versus round 2. But I think the bottom line, and what I would really encourage you to think about, though, is that you want to put forth a package that really does represent the best possible version of yourself. And whether that means perhaps waiting until a later round 2, it may be worth waiting just to ensure that you are really putting forth the best possible package. I think the big question then comes when folks start thinking about round 2 versus round 3, and there is a very big difference between round 2 and later rounds. So that would be round 3 and round 4, if applicable. And the reason there is that, with round 3 and round 4, most of the seats in cohorts are typically taken by the time you get to round 3 and round 4. And so by the time those admissions officers are looking at applications in those later rounds, they are typically looking for some very, very specific types of profiles. And so in many cases, if you're not the purple squirrel they're looking for, even if you are incredibly accomplished and have fantastic essays, it may just not be the right fit for the program at that time. And so I do encourage folks to think about, if you're coming up against round 2 deadlines and you are still not quite feeling prepared, or that your application represents the best of you, it probably is worth considering. Do you consider delaying to the next application cycle? And that is something that's obviously a very personal decision, and one that you would need to weigh on your own. But that certainly should be a part of the calculus, especially when you start thinking about the types of folks who are applying to these programs. So let's talk a little bit about professional experience. So the number one question that I get from folks is, how much experience do I need to be competitive? And, for anyone who's researching programs, I'm sure you're looking at the first year student profiles. Every school posts them. And so you'll see that, on average, folks have somewhere between 3 and 7 years of work experience. There obviously are exceptions to every rule. I've worked with some folks who have matriculated directly out of an undergrad program into an MBA program. And there certainly are some exceptions. But really, when you go back to that first slide, when I talked about sort of what holistic admissions is, I think the thing to remember here is that, schools are really looking at the experience and the stories that you're going to be able to bring to a cohort. So what have you done in your professional life that is going to make you a much more valuable contributor in the classroom? How are you going to make the other people around you better? And so the general thought is that it takes at least 3 years of experience in the corporate world to be able to really have meaningful contributions in the classroom. Again, there are always exceptions to every rule. You have some folks with less experience, you have some folks with more experience. And I think a lot of this comes down to then how you are able to talk about that experience, number one, in your resume and position it, but number two, in your essays. So if there are very specific reasons that you chose to work a little bit longer before pursuing an MBA, it's important that you're able to clearly articulate that and explain to a school why maybe you were not a great candidate for an MBA program at the year 5 or 6 mark, and why perhaps maybe you waited until year 8 or 9. Schools, schools really try to give candidates the benefit of the doubt. It's just incumbent on the applicant to really be able to explain your motivations and your reasons for making the decisions that you have. Just a couple of other notes on experience. So internships, it's a common question that I get as well too. Do internships count? I would say meaningful internships certainly can count, but if you're starting to piecemeal 3 months here, 3 months there, it is going to be a little bit tougher, a little bit of a tougher sell. And so I encourage folks, what you really are looking at primarily is the work experience you've accrued after graduation. Now, for folks maybe who are working full-time while enrolled in an undergrad program, that certainly can count. But I do encourage folks, when you think about the cumulative work experience, for the most part, you're talking about work experience after graduation from an undergrad program. Military experience, for those who served in the military experience translates on a 1-to-1 ratio, essentially. So a year of military service is going to equate to about a year of corporate experience as well. So that's certainly something to keep in mind too, as you if that applies to you. We could probably spend a whole webinar or 5 webinars talking about essays and what makes for good essays. But I do want to just offer a couple of thoughts sort of on, especially for folks, since all of those essay questions have come out in recent weeks, just to think a little bit more about how to sort of get started if you haven't already. So the thing about a great essay is, a great essay is going to be something that really ties together your professional experience and brings your resume to life. So the resume really sort of tells the what, and the essay kind of tells the why and the how. The essays are going to be a place for you to also talk about your post-MBA goals. This is where you need to be incredibly focused and specific about what is the value that an MBA is going to bring to your personal and professional experience. And more importantly, why is this particular type of MBA? So why is the HBS MBA or why is the Wharton or McCombs MBA uniquely positioned to help you unlock and achieve your future goals? I cannot stress the importance of fit enough here. And for folks who think that they can write one sort of general personal statement and then repurpose it or recycle it for every school, there certainly are elements that you're going to be able to recycle across multiple schools, but it is really important for you to think about what is the unique fit that you have with a particular program, and make sure that you are tailoring your personal statement and all of those essays to that specific school. And so when you think about brainstorming, when you think about researching, this is why I do suggest that, if you are thinking about several programs, to rank stack those programs, because I think folks oftentimes underestimate how much time that research is actually going to take. The amount of time it really takes to understand a program, the value that they bring to the table, what types of career pathways students and graduates are going off to pursue, really does take some time. And research is going to be more than just going to a website or following a program on social media. I encourage you, even if you've gone to an event, if you've gone to an info session, try to attend as many events as you can, especially any type of event where that might include a panel discussion with current students or alumni who are talking about their experiences. Any opportunity to really sort of get a firsthand glimpse into what the student experience is like and how students are using that MBA experience to launch the next phase of their career is going to be incredibly valuable. And so again, when you think about research, make sure that you're thinking about research through multiple lenses and through multiple channels. The other thing to think about too, when you think about brainstorming, I would encourage you to think also about, as you think about sort of your personal sort of point of view or your perspective here, is to think a little bit about yourself or your profile in some ways as a bit of a brand. And I don't mean to make that sound like a commodity by any means. But I do think that it's important as you think about how you're going to uniquely position your story and your particular profile. You want to think about this in some ways as a branding exercise. So what are your differentiators? What are your reasons to believe? And one of the ways that you can do that is by thinking about yourself through 3 lenses, through these lenses of expertise, purpose, and authenticity. And this is an exercise that I'll go through with all of my clients and encourage them to think about, expertise is the easy one. That's what are you good at? And it could be that you are a whiz in finance or you're a ninja when it comes to Excel or Google Sheets. There are, I think, expertise is usually those are usually the things that you would rattle off probably in an elevator pitch. Purpose and authenticity are a little bit tougher. Purpose is what drives you, or the sort of the gut check is what gets you out of bed in the morning. And so, for some folks, maybe it is Excel spreadsheets that get you out of bed in the morning. But I suspect for the vast majority, it probably isn't. I suspect for the vast majority, there's probably something a bit higher order or a little bit more strategic that's getting you out of bed in the morning and that's getting the creative juices flowing. If you are involved in volunteer or extracurricular sort of work outside of your job, chances are there's probably a personal passion attached to whatever it is you might be doing. And so I encourage folks to really think about how do you start layering now the expertise with the purpose? And then finally, when you think about authenticity, the authenticity piece is really related to what makes you uniquely you. And I think a really good exercise to think about this is, certainly sit down and think about 2 or 3 things that you believe make you uniquely you. But I think it's also important to think about how others view you. And so a great exercise you can do as well is to talk to a couple of folks in different circles or in different sort of concentric circles of your life. Maybe it's a parent, or maybe it's a mentor, an aunt or an uncle, someone someone who has mentored you and sort of watched you grow, both personally or professionally. Maybe it's a sibling, maybe it's a best friend or a roommate, and then maybe it's a coworker as well. Because I think it's important to recognize that, while we certainly are who we are at our core, we oftentimes will show up as different versions of ourselves to different people in our lives. And so it's good to get a sense of how others view you and how do others describe you, and potentially even think about how do others describe you in terms of and through the lens of expertise as well, if you're comfortable asking some of those questions. And that's a great exercise to sort of level set and see, like, what are the common themes and what are some of those common threads throughout those descriptions, but also where are some of the variations? And does that provide an opportunity for you to really think about how you want to talk about yourself in your application? So again, a variety of different ways to get started with brainstorming, but I do think from a personal, as you start thinking about your personal perspective or your point of view that you want to start shaping in your application, that's a great exercise for everyone to start thinking about how are you going to choose to talk about the things that you've done, but more importantly, the things that really do make you uniquely you. Let's switch over and talk just a little bit about testing. So GMAT, GRE, EA are all pretty much the standard options these days when it comes to testing. Many schools, as you probably know, do offer test optional or test waivers as an option. And one of the things that I think many folks assume is that if you get a waiver, that's a win. You don't have to take the test, and now that's an advantage. I would encourage you to think about this, especially if, for example, maybe your undergrad GPA is below the reported average for a program, or maybe you're a little bit lighter on work experience, or maybe your work experience isn't always of the highest quality. As I had mentioned at the beginning, the test score is the one piece of the application you do have some control over. So before you go applying for test waivers because you're not excited about the idea of testing, do think about, would a good test score considerably boost your application? And so while it's not a black or white answer in terms of whether or not test optional or waivers hurt students, I do think it is interesting to note when you start looking at some of the top programs, the rejection rate for students who do receive test waivers is significantly higher than most folks often anticipate. I know for a couple of M7 programs within the last couple of years, I believe the rejection rate was close to 40%, or 50%, if I recall correctly, for folks who had received those waivers. And so again, I would just encourage you to think a little bit more about, does the waiver truly help, or does it hurt you personally? And then with regards to which test you should take, if you are early in the process, I would encourage you to take a diagnostic of both the GMAT and the GRE. They are going to be testing slightly different skills, and to be really candid, the quant section, I think, on the GRE it does tend to be a bit easier, especially for folks who are not necessarily wired for quants. But you should absolutely take the test that you feel you're going to perform the best on, and it's going to represent your abilities the best. And really the best way to do that, or to get a gauge on that, is to take a diagnostic of each test. The EA is the executive assessment. It was originally designed for MBA programs, though many full-time programs have started to adopt it as well. It certainly is something you can consider as well, but the GMAT and the GRE as most folks know, are kind of the standards that have been in place for a while. But again, if you are starting early in the process, I would encourage you to take a little bit of time and see which feels like a better fit for you before starting down the path. So resumes, as I mentioned before, resumes, are kind of that best kept secret in some ways, but oftentimes I find are one of the most overlooked pieces of an application. And so I always encourage folks to spend some time with your resume early in the process, or fairly early in the process, to make sure that the resume is working for you. The resume should be telling the story of what you have done. The biggest question that I get from folks is, why do I have to update my resume? If I was able to land a great job with it, why do I need to update it for business schools? And the reality is, when you think about a business or a corporate resume, the purpose of that resume is to help you land a job. And so you're trying to show basically mastery of certain technical skills to a recruiter, to the hiring manager. And so you really are looking in many ways sort of backwards at what are the things that you have been able to do, what are the skills you bring to the table, and summarizing sort of those experiences. When you think about an MBA resume, your audience is going to be an admissions officer. It's not going to be a recruiter. So number one, they may not necessarily have a frame of reference for the particular type of work that you're doing within your industry. But more importantly, they're looking for potential. They're looking to see what types of results have you driven? What type of impact have you had in the roles that you've had? And then when you start thinking about some of those wonderful soft skills, grit, perseverance, leadership, have you been able to create some opportunities for yourself to lead? If you've had projects that you've worked on potentially, if there are impressive metrics to share, absolutely include those in your resume. Or if there's something maybe that didn't go quite as you were hoping, maybe what was the result, or what did you sort of learn from that, and how did your career pivot potentially because of that? So really think about what is the story that you are trying to tell in your resume, and really make sure that you're including, wherever possible, some quantifiable metrics to show what you've actually done. Letters of recommendation. This is another one that folks, I feel, sometimes sort of phone in or wait till the end to work on. And this is really something that I encourage folks to think about, really engaging with folks much earlier in the process and thinking about how to weave the letters of recommendation into their application very actively. Excuse me. So most schools are going to ask for 1 or 2 letters of rec. And in an ideal world, they're going to want one from a direct manager or a supervisor from your current role. For many folks, I know that that's not always possible. Maybe you haven't shared with your employer or your manager that you're applying to business school. Maybe that's something that you're not able to share. And so there are a lot of different options. We can certainly talk about it if folks have questions for asking other folks. But ideally, you want someone who has supervised you and who has actually been able to, who's seen your work and can sort of speak to the quality of work that you've produced. And what you've been able to do sort of in your current and or previous roles. What I do encourage folks to do when you think about letters of rec is, number one, as you think about the folks that you want to ask, I would certainly come up with a short list. I wouldn't limit it to just 1 or 2 folks. I would try to build a list that includes 3 or 4, and then start building a matrix where you map out certain technical and soft skills that each individual would be able to speak to. And a great place to start building that list is by looking at the letter of recommendation questions or the skills and characteristics they're asking the recommender to evaluate you on. And so if you're able to map that to skills that you certainly have and experiences that you have, that's a great place to get started, just to ensure alignment with what the school is looking for in that letter of rec. The next step then is to start bulleting out certain stories or experiences that you feel really represents some of those skills. In an ideal world, you're going to ask someone to write you a letter of rec. They will say, yes, it'll be fantastic. And then you will say, thank you. And here's a 1-pager with some guidance that will help you with the writing. I always encourage folks, not every single letter writer is going to be open to this, but for the vast majority of them, I find that folks are really appreciative of receiving some type of guidance from the candidate. That includes a copy of your resume, as well as some articulation around what your goals are beyond business school, because it is important for your recommender to, number one, recognize that, but number two, if they can tie some of those goals to things that you have done in roles, that again is just going to strengthen your argument in your application even more so for the program. And then finally, as I mentioned, take a look at that grid, make sure that you are covering as many of your bases as you possibly can when it comes to skills. You want there to be just enough tangential overlap so that it feels like these people are talking about the same person, but you really want to make sure that you're not being overly redundant. And so you want to make sure that you have different people telling the same stories or talking about the exact same skills and experiences. You want to make sure that there is some diversity there. And again, think of this as additional real estate that you're able to leverage in your application to talk about things that maybe you haven't been able to talk to or speak to in your resume or in your essays. Extracurriculars. So I know for a lot of folks who work in certain industries, you may already be putting in 60, 70, 80 hours a week. And so actually the idea of adding an additional extracurricular outside of work is just, it's frankly, it's probably not possible for many folks. And so for folks who have limited or no extracurriculars, I do encourage you, to number one, think about, are there opportunities within your current company to do certain things? And what that means is, potentially, are there affinity groups? Are there potentially cohorts of interns who come through every summer? Are there organic opportunities within your company or organization where you can do some additional work, essentially? And whether that's mentorship or whether that might be a passion project working with an affinity group. Number one, I would say try to look for opportunities sort of in your own backyard there, because that is going to be a bit of an easier lift, especially if you're not able to get out of to sort of clock out of the office on a regular basis for anything outside of work. For those of you who are looking to sort of for quick fixes for your application, the reality is at this point, if you're planning on applying round one or round two, there isn't a lot that you can do now to really, I think, authentically add additional activities to your resume. But what I would encourage you to do, though, is if you are limited on extracurriculars, I would make sure that you figure out sort of how to talk about in your application what value you're going to bring to the community. So what types of things are you interested in? As you go through and researching and research schools and programs, are there fellowship programs? Are there clubs, other organizations? What are the things that you are excited about doing when you get to campus, in addition to just going to class? And so make sure that really does become a part of your application. And then certainly there are ways to address sort of maybe that lack of extracurriculars in other places. But again, I would just encourage folks to, especially if you're applying round one, at this point, it's pretty late in the game to try to add something additional to your resume at this point. But I would encourage you to try to think about what can you do when you get to campus. Or if there are things, like I said, that opportunities maybe within your company organization that you can get involved with, that's probably some lower hanging fruit that's a little bit easier to take advantage of. Interview and sort of miscellaneous. So we do get a lot of questions about just sort of how do I prepare for the interview, and there's probably a whole webinar buried in here as well. But what I will just say about the interview is, one of the things that I encourage folks to do when we work together is they are going through and identifying stories, experiences, anecdotes that they are considering for various places in their application. So whether it be essays or a place on the resume, or potentially something for one of their letter writers. If there's stuff that sort of ends up sort of on the, for lack of a better term, kind of like on the cutting room floor, if there's stuff that just doesn't have a home, I encourage folks to put it in what we call sort of a parking lot. And that can be content then that, if you are invited to interview, perhaps there are ways to incorporate that into your interview prep or stories that you share there. Perhaps if there's a video essay component, maybe there's a place for that there as well. But when it comes to the interview, most schools are going to be conducting interviews on a fairly blind basis, meaning that the interviewer, in some cases like HBS, the interviewer will receive your entire package, but in most cases, the interviewer might receive your resume and nothing else. And so it is important then to think about, how do you want to, number one, how are you able to tell your story effectively and succinctly, depending on how much information the interviewer has. But number two, what are the things that you really want to choose to build on or to extrapolate on in that interview? And what are some of those additional sort of secondary stories and examples that you can use to really do that in the interview? All right, so those are the questions that we received ahead of time. So let's take a look and see what has come in now. We've got about another 20 minutes or so. So let's take a look here. Let's see. So we have some questions. We do have some questions from folks who are looking at deferred entry programs. and also differences between specialized masters potentially and MBA programs. So if for folks who are looking at deferred entry programs, the job so if you are in school right now, and if you are looking, for example, if you're looking at a program like Yale where you're going to work, for example, before starting the program for a year or so, it's certainly going to be important. You want to make sure that the job that you land during that deferral period is one that is very consistent with the goals that you articulate in your application for your post-MBA career. And so if you are interested in working, for example, in healthcare policy, but you get a job in finance, that's not necessarily going to be a great match. It's not saying that you necessarily have to go and work in consulting in the healthcare space, but you do want to have a role or try to land a role that is going to be consistent, where you can at least tell a compelling story about how this is going to help you get to sort of that next level. Similarly, for specialized master's programs, oftentimes, you have a lot of folks who are applying directly to specialized master's programs right out of undergrad. And so you're not necessarily going to have work experience as you apply to those programs. But it's something to consider, though, if you're looking at working between completing that master's and then getting an MBA. You want to make sure that the work or the job that you land between your specialized master's and business school, again, is going to be one that really builds on the expertise that you've built in that specialized master's program, and one that is going to help tee you up to basically explain why the MBA is going to be a good fit for you a couple of years down the road. So we have a couple of questions, let's see here, about just sort of what holistic means, and how to make tips on how to sort of make your application a bit more holistic. I think the best thing that I would say here is, I went through every sort of piece of the application. I would just make sure that you are very cognizant of the pieces that you can control and the pieces you can't control. And what I mean by that is when you think about, as I mentioned, the letters of rec and the resume are two things that I see candidates very often either punt on or wait until the last minute on, because they feel like, well, I'll just use the resume that I use to apply to my current job, and letters of rec are out of my control because people are going to write what they want to write. And I would really encourage you to think about, to really sort of think about sort of what additional stories, what additional data points you can incorporate into some of those other pieces to make your application work for you. So questions about some less traditional candidates. So we have folks, it looks like we have a couple folks who are military, and then just in general advice for maybe non-traditional candidates. We have a couple folks, it looks like, who are maybe a little bit older. So what I would encourage you to really think about is, if you are an older candidate or a non-traditional candidate, this is where program selection is going to be really important. And so I think for a lot of folks, they just assume full-time is the way to do it. Let me get the program over with. Let me lean in completely. It'll give me a chance to build a network. I really would encourage you to think about, especially if you are an older applicant and have, and especially have more than 10 years of work experience, think about the folks that you're going to be surrounding yourself with, because so much of the MBA program experience is really tied to what you're able to learn from the individuals around you in your cohort. What you'll find is that, and this is why schools are looking for folks with professional experiences. Accounting is accounting is accounting. Marketing is marketing. There are, it's not like there's some sort of magic fairy dust that they sprinkle on it at certain schools and not at others. But what's really going to add to the richness of your program experience is going to be hearing from other individuals, from your peers, about the challenges that they've faced, experiences that they've had in their own professional lives that really help bring these concepts to life. And so if you are at a different point in your career, it's important to ask yourself, am I going to have anything in common with the people sitting next to me? Am I going to be able to benefit from this network? Or are they going to be able to learn more from me potentially? And so it's really important to think about program fit here. And so for many folks, they think that full-time is the only or the best option. But I would encourage you to think about, if you are working actively and maybe you are a couple years older, does a part-time program make sense for you? For a lot of folks, a part-time program can be a good fit because folks can still continue to work. They're not giving up income for a couple of years while they complete the program. The other upside in many ways to the part-time program is that, you are more often than not with a slightly older and more experienced cohort. And so you're going to have people who are at slightly different stages in their career and are going to be able to offer a different perspective. And certainly even more so for MBA. I think the thought has always been you need at least 10 years of work experience or 15 years of work experience to be competitive for an MBA program. And the reality is that there are many programs where the average number of years of work experience is closer to 7 to 9. And so it is important to think about, wherever you are in your career, what are the motivations that you have for wanting to pursue the MBA, whatever shape or size it is, and really think about the value that the degree is going to bring to your career at that point in time. So we have a couple of questions here that are a little bit more industry specific. One of the things that I'll encourage you to do as well is certainly please feel free to sign up for a free consultation through the Target Test Prep website. I'm more than happy to, they're free 15-minute consultations. I'm more than happy to walk through some of those more sort of candidate specific questions that you might have, especially if they are specific to a very particular industry. We have a question that's like here about letters of rec. So if there are 2 letters of rec required, and if you've only worked at one job, who should be writing the other one? And so I would encourage you to think about, so first one should ideally come from a supervisor. The second one could certainly come from a peer, or if you have significant extracurricular experience, I would think about, is there someone in a leadership role, maybe at an organization that you've been very active with, who could potentially write one of those letters of rec for you as well too. And again, I think that's why it's important to go through that, building that matrix and mapping out sort of skills and experiences to different individuals to really see who's going to be able to speak to certain skill sets and experiences that you have, and who's going to be best in the best position to speak to that. We have a question about the new writing assessment potentially that HBS has been talking about, and so I can speak a little bit to that. For anyone who is looking at HBS, as you know, GMAT Focus was the new version of the GMAT that launched in January. It is now, I believe as of July 1st, it has been affectionately just renamed GMAT. But there isn't a writing assessment that is a part of that exam anymore. For 50 years, there was a writing assessment. There actually were 2 essays for a very long time, but now there is no longer one. And so HBS announced last week that for candidates who are invited to interview, they may be asked to take an additional writing assessment that will be administered by GMAC. And so that is something to just certainly keep an eye on. It is not a free assessment. It is something that candidates would have to pay for. And it remains to be seen if other schools will hop on board and make that a requirement as well. But this really is designed, I believe the motivation for this is to really make sure that schools have writing samples that they know haven't been unduly influenced by the use of AI. And so, and on that note, I would also just mention, that's a common question that comes up as well. I understand folks use AI for everything these days. And in 99% of the cases, I'm a huge supporter of that and say, absolutely, you should be using AI in a variety of situations. When it comes to thinking, though, about your essays and about your application, all I can say is, these should all be original thoughts and ideas that come from you, because you're talking about your own personal experiences and motivations. And one of the biggest topics of conversation that I've seen at every industry conference that I've attended in the last year and a half has been around the use of AI and how to detect the use of AI in applications. And so I would just encourage you to try and minimize AI essentially in your applications as much as possible. And again, and if you are applying to HBS and are fortunate enough to be interviewed, just make sure that you're tracking that there may be a writing assessment in your future as well. So we have some questions about resume and bullets and how long resumes should be and how long bullets should be. So a couple things just on resumes. So I think the number one piece of advice I will give you is that unless you have 10 years of work experience, your resume needs to fit on one page, number one. Number two, if you are former military, I definitely would encourage you to work with someone to try and translate that military experience into business jargon. Or business speak. There are so many things, and I can tell you right now, I married into the military 20 years ago, and I've worked with countless military veterans over the years. There are so many wonderful experiences that military veterans bring to the table that absolutely can map to corporate experience. When you think about fiscal management, when you think about personnel management, certainly when you think about soft skills, but it is so important to really try and translate the work that you've done in the military into business language the civilian is going to understand. I give this advice to my military clients as well as, frankly, as well as my engineers. But I always tell folks, you should be able to give your resume to someone who doesn't know anything about your background. And so the litmus test, I call it the grandma test. If you can give your resume to your grandma, who probably doesn't understand a ton about engineering or maybe what you've done in the military, and they can understand or at least paraphrase back to you what you've done in your professional career, then your resume is great. But your resume should not be overly technical because, again, you don't want to assume that the person reading it on the other end is going to have that subject matter expertise. In terms of, I think there were a couple of other questions in here talking about just sort of length of bullets as well. You absolutely, the bullets should be commensurate with experience. And so bullets can absolutely extend beyond one line. But what I would encourage you to think about holistically is when you look at your experience holistically, if you spent 6 months in a particular billet or in a particular role and have 4 bullets, but then you have a role that you spent maybe 3 years on, and that only has 2 bullets. I think there's a little bit of a mismatch or a misalignment here. And so make sure that the amount of content that you're building is going to be commensurate with the amount of time you spent in the roles. Visually, number one, it's just something that you want to make sure that it's tracking throughout your resume. But more importantly, it's going to look a little peculiar if you have several accomplishments in a very short period of time, but not nearly as much to show for an experience that was significantly longer. Question about also, can we include college internships on resumes? For folks who are a little bit closer to that 3 years or less mark, if it's a meaningful experience, a meaningful internship that relates to your current line of work or your future plans, especially if you're thinking about pivoting into a different space, certainly feel free to include internships. Just make sure, again, that you have meaningful metrics-driven bullets wherever possible. If it's something that isn't, or if you were lifeguarding during the summer, certainly you don't need to include all of those part-time jobs. But if it is relevant experience, then it absolutely is fair game. Let's see. We have a question too about how do I balance test prep with applications? Because I don't want to pick schools or start my applications until I have my test score in hand. This is probably one of the biggest, most popular questions I've been receiving actually over the last 4 to 6 weeks, especially with the release of all of the application prompts. One of the things that I will encourage you to think about is, number one, you cannot possibly be spending 24 hours a day, 7 days a week preparing for the GMAT or the GRE. If you are, something has gone seriously awry. But number two, you're going to reach a point of diminishing returns. And so what I would encourage you to really do is start parallel tracking some of this work. If you are not comfortable committing to a school until you have that score in hand, that is absolutely fine. But there are other things that you can start working on. You can start doing some of the high-level brainstorming and thinking about what your personal narrative is going to look like. What are the things that you're going to want to talk about in your application? What are your post-MBA goals, short-term, long-term? None of that is going to change based on what you score on the GMAT or the GRE. Start working on your resume. Start thinking about letters of recommendation. As you'll see, most of the letters of rec are going to be similar or consistent in terms of the types of things they're asking people to write about or evaluate you on. So again, start building that matrix out now. You will find, especially if you're not testing until late summer or early fall, even if you're thinking about round 2 and you've given up on round 1, some of this reflection work really does take a couple of months. It's not like you're just going to sit down on one Saturday afternoon and knock out your entire personal statement and have it be perfect the first time out of the gate. And so I really do encourage folks to think about what can you parallel track while you are preparing for your exams so that you are in the best possible position. The best part of this is if you're scheduled to test in late summer and you've already started working on your applications, this really puts you in a great position then to potentially make a go at round 1 if you've been doing all this work in parallel. And I will say for a lot of the clients with whom I'm working with on round 1 applications, it is easy enough for us to build out a workflow for folks to be able to have ample time to be able to work their full-time job, to be able to prep appropriately, and to start working on some of those elements and even do some school-specific work in some cases. So I would encourage you, wherever you're on the process, just think about how you can parallel track some of this, because if you wait until you have the score in hand to start working on applications, more often than not, you either are not going to have enough time or you're going to feel incredibly rushed in terms of putting together a solid product. So a couple questions here on professional work experience. So some folks wanted to find out, what if I haven't managed people, or what if I haven't had any P&L responsibilities or been promoted? And so I would encourage you to think about what other accomplishments can you talk about in your current roles? What other things, maybe if you haven't managed people directly, have you been able to influence or have you been able to lead without authority? Sometimes those types of experiences are even more impressive than direct leadership, because you're now talking about trying to influence and persuade individuals where you don't necessarily have authority over them. And so the ability to be able to get work done cross-functionally, I think sometimes can be even more impressive than the former. So again, I would just try to think about what are the experiences that you have, and what are the differentiators? How does it stand out when you think about what are the skills you've had to build in order to do well there? All right, so we have a couple questions here about sort of post MBA planning as well. So exercises or brainstorming to really think about, to help people think about what they want to do after business school. One of the things, I think there are a lot of different reasons to go to business school. Most people who go to business school, I feel like, are using business school to either pivot into a new sort of career pathway, or they've reached a point in their career where they've plateaued and they know they aren't going to be able to necessarily get to the next level without the MBA. And there are specific skills that they're looking for to build in order to get to that next level. What I would encourage you to think about is, before you do any of this, think about which of those sort of pathways you sort of fall into. If it is a complete career pivot, then I would think about what are two things that are interesting to you. Are you interested in being an entrepreneur? Are you interested, if you've been in consulting, or you're thinking about moving into finance? You don't have to have it all figured out, but having at least a sense of direction in terms of industry is going to really be helpful. And then this is when I encourage folks to really start tapping into both online events, but also their own network. So start talking to folks who have gone to business school, or if there are folks at your company who have MBAs, ask them, the 15-minute coffee chat is a great opportunity to sort of learn a little bit more about someone's background, learn about their motivations. 9 times out of 10, I think people are really surprised by the motivations and reasons people had when they went to business school, and maybe what they ended up doing afterwards. But this really is where I think the human connection can really help with research. And then certainly, do your own research when you think about what are the types of roles that you could potentially see yourself in. A lot of the folks that I work with will come to me and say, I am working in industry X. I want to move into industry Y. And that's about as far as they've gotten. And very often, more often than not, we'll get a few months into the process, and we'll realize that they actually maybe don't want to move into industry Y. They actually want to do something completely different based on some of that reflection work that we do, because they realize that there are certain skills and experiences that they want, but they really sort of thought there was a sort of a more prescribed pathway. And so again, I'd encourage you to tap into your networks, talk to as many folks as you can, connect with folks and sort of understand what types of experiences that they've had, but really do spend that time reflecting and thinking about what are the experiences that you want to have, what are the areas of interest that you have. And then spend as much time as you can trying to find individuals who have followed some of those pathways as well. So we have some questions here about what if the work experience that I have is not totally related. And so if it feels a little bit like your resume is kind of like a game of ping pong, and where you've sort of bounced around a little bit, that's really important, number one, to be able to address in your story somewhere. It's not unheard of for folks to start down a certain path. I think especially for anyone who graduated either right before COVID or during COVID, I've seen a lot of folks who have started down, who took a job in a certain industry because there was a bit of uncertainty around what the economy was going to look like. And so they thought, well, any job is better than no job. And they bounced around a little bit trying to figure things out. As I had mentioned before, schools really want to give folks the benefit of the doubt, and they want to understand why you've made the decisions that you have. And so I would just really encourage you to think about, in your particular instance, what was the calculus? What was the decision making, or what was the decision making process like for you? And what were the things that were important to you in the moment that drove you to make some of those decisions? And then honestly, just own that. Schools are going to want to hear they're going to want to hear your story. And especially if a lot of the roles really do feel unrelated and you are testing out a lot of things, it's even more important for a school to understand what the motivation was there. So again, think a little bit. And the other thing I would encourage you to think about too is, as you are building out your resume bullets and rewriting those, do try to look for some commonalities. So were there some skills maybe that you built in one role that you then were able to apply in future roles. So look for some organic ways to try and connect the dots there as well. Let's see. I think we've got time. We've got time for maybe just one more question. Here. So we have some folks who want to know, is it too late to apply in round one? Maybe that's a good one to end tonight on. And I will just tell you right now, as I mentioned, most round one deadlines are anywhere from 6 to 8 weeks out. If you haven't started, it is certainly not too late. But I would encourage you, if you are thinking about round one aggressively, even if it's just for 1 or 2 programs, you do want to get started, even if you are preparing for exams right now. Take the time to start doing some of that personal reflection work, do the school research, and start building that list so that way you really can understand sort of what your personal priorities are and what you're hoping to accomplish. And so that way, when you do get to that point, a week or 2 before deadlines, sort of what's the bare minimum that you're looking at in terms of quality, and what is going to be a reasonable package to submit potentially round one. So I would encourage you, if you are thinking about round, you absolutely have to, you absolutely have the time to be able to get started. And then it looks like there was just a quick follow-up question that came in around evaluating schools. Yes, the school packages with TTP do include that school strategy and engagement. And so for a lot of the clients I'm working with right now through TTP, they've purchased, a 2 or 3 school package, and they don't know which schools they're applying to necessarily. We're working through that strategy. And that's certainly something, if you sign up for a consultation, we can certainly talk about that during your consultation as well. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much to everyone for joining us today. I really appreciated the time, all the wonderful questions, and I wish you all the very best of luck as you continue with both your test preparation and your MBA application journey. Thank you so much, and I hope to chat with many of you in a consultation very soon. Enjoy the rest of your day.